Good morning. I'm Samantha Tweedy, CEO of the Black Economic Alliance. Thank you for being with us today. At our BEA Solutions Summit back in May, we had the unique opportunity for Raj Chetty, Professor of Economics and Director of Opportunity Insights at Harvard University, to preview forthcoming new data. And as those of you who were with us for the summit can attest, it is no exaggeration to say that the audience was literally on the edge of their seats. The room was buzzing because even in that preview, we saw how much there was to learn from this data for our efforts to advance Black work, wages, and wealth. With the new Changing Opportunity Data Report released just last week, we are very glad to have Raj back with us today for a presentation of the data and to be joined as well by three experts, author of The Sum of Us and BEA Advisory Board member Heather McGhee, president of Blue Meridian Partners Jim Shelton, and senior partner at McKinsey, Shelley Stewart, for a follow-up panel discussion of the data and its implications for solutions to advance Black economic opportunity. As you will hear, today, the data offers important insights into what has worked to improve economic mobility for Black children in low-income families, and there has been improvement, which we are eager to recognize. We'll also hear about the critical context that shapes the full picture of the data. More Black Americans are moving out of poverty, yet without coming anywhere close to their white counterparts economically. And we're seeing this important reality getting lost in some of the discussion around this new research. Worse is the implication in some of the discussion around the data that improvements in economic mobility are zero-sum, that improvements in economic mobility for Black Americans are coming at the expense of white Americans, yet the opposite is true. So we're very excited about today's discussion because at BEA, we know how important it is, both that data be the driving force behind shaping the solutions that we advance, and that we are shaping the conversation around that data to ensure that it's correctly understood and utilized. One operational note before I turn this over to Raj for the data presentation and then the panel to follow, which is that we have a Q&A box that is on each of your screens. Please share questions as the conversation goes. We'll have an opportunity to speak to some of those questions at the end of the panel discussion. With that, thank you again for being with us this morning, and let me turn it over to Raj.
Thanks so much, Sam, for the very warm, Samantha, for the very warm introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be with the Black Economic Alliance once again to discuss the very important issues that we are all working on together. So I'm going to share a few slides here on this latest data that our team has just released in this paper on changing opportunity. I was delighted to be able to give you all a preview of these data a few weeks ago. And now that the work is out publicly, I'm excited to have the chance to go into more depth and talk with the panelists about the implications of this work for improving economic mobility for Black Americans and for everyone going forward. So just to set the stage, I want to start with data not from this study, but from a map that has been on my mind for the past 10 years, from a study our team put out back in 2014 called The Land of Opportunity, which was the first look at the geography of economic mobility in America using the tools of big data. So I'm going to take a second to describe what this map shows because it will really set the stage for what I'm going to discuss in today's presentation, and then get into the new work. So what we did in the study from 10 years ago is took data on all kids born in the US around 1980, millions of children, got information from anonymized tax returns that allowed us to link them back to their parents and back to the specific area in which they grew up. We divided the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, following these kids over time using tax returns, we calculated a very simple measure of upward mobility. We asked if you were a kid born to a low-income family, a family making $27,000 a year, for instance, how much are you making when we look at your 1040 tax returns when you're 35 years old? So you can see, for example, that in the Boston metro area where I am right now, kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, on average, were making about $36,800 when they were in their mid-30s. We similarly calculate that statistic for all of the other metro and rural areas and color the map so that blue-green colors represent areas where kids are more likely to rise up and achieve the American dream of upward mobility. And the red-orange colors are places with lower levels of economic mobility, where kids growing up in low-income families have lower levels of earnings when they grow up. You can see the broad patterns for yourselves. Many of you have seen this map before. In the rural Midwest, kids have great chances of rising up. Take a place like Dubuque, Iowa. If you're growing up in a family making $27,000 a year, on average, you're making $45,000 or even $50,000 a year when you grow up, a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other places like much of the Southeast, cities like Charlotte, Cincinnati, Cleveland, where kids growing up in low-income families are making less than their parents were a generation ago, which is kind of shocking given the amount of economic growth that has occurred in the US over the past several decades. So this map, I think, did two things in the field. First, there was a lot of interest in policy circles in trying to understand what can we do in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, which ranks 50th out of the 50 largest American cities in terms of children's chances of rising up, to increase economic mobility. And so we and many others got lots of inquiries about, now that we know that there are these big differences across places and economic opportunity, what can we do to remedy that? How can we make the American dream accessible to more people? At the same time, these new data also gave us a new lens to study the science of economic opportunity with a precision that was just simply infeasible in the past. We could now ask questions like, what's different about San Francisco or Salt Lake City versus Washington, D.C. or Charlotte? Why is it that economic mobility varies so much across these places? What lessons can we learn about how this all works? One lesson that emerged from the many papers that have been written over the past decade using these data that our Opportunity Insights team put out publicly is that the roots of these differences often lie in long-standing historical factors. Let me give you an example. Here's a nice analysis done by a demographer named Thor Berger, published in 2018, where he took our data on upward mobility, shown in the map on the right, and compared it to data on rates of slavery back in 1860 from the 1860 census. And you can see a striking correspondence here. It's precisely in the areas where slavery was most prevalent 150 years ago that you see the lowest levels of upward mobility today. And there's subsequent work showing that this is because of institutional changes and other things, segregation and so on, that have had really persistent effects on American society. And so this and many other lines of research have identified things like redlining, other historical practices that have cast a long shadow in affecting economic mobility. And so where that left me, and I think a number of others, was kind of with a conundrum and a feeling of a bit of concern that on the one hand, we're trying to change economic opportunity through policy. All of us want to make a difference within our lifetimes in a time frame that's relevant for policymakers. Yet on the other hand, we're seeing this data that some of the roots of these differences are from things that occurred 150 years ago. So where does that leave us in terms of really being able to change opportunity going forward? And that's what this new study is about, and that's what the new data that I'm going to share with you today is about. So in this new research, what we've done is expanded on that 2014 study, which focused on kids born around 1980, and basically made use of the gift of time. 10 years have passed, so now we can look at additional cohorts of children who have started to work, whose outcomes we can start to see, use an additional decade of tax data to analyze changes in outcomes for 57 million kids now, born between 1978 and 1992. So we're basically going to ask, over that time period, how did that map that I started out with change? In particular, what we're going to do, just so you're clear on the details, is measure kids' incomes when they are 27 years old. Why age 27? If you measure income much before that, people are still completing college or graduate school. You can't get a reliable measure of their incomes. And that's going to mean, if we're looking at kids born between 1978 and 1992, we're going to be looking at their earnings from 2005 out to 2019 for kids born in 1992 who turned 27 in 2019, right before the pandemic. So that's the time period we're going to be examining. So let's dive into the data and see what we learned from these new cohorts. So I'm going to start with a map for white children born to low-income parents back in 1978. And if you look at this map now shown at the county level in these new data, same exact statistics that I was showing you initially on rates of upward mobility, same color scheme. You can see a pattern that looks very much like what I showed you in the initial map, much lower rates of upward mobility in the industrial Midwest, in the Southeast, higher rates of upward mobility in the Great Plains and parts of the coast. So now we can ask, how did this change over time? This map here shows you the exact same analysis, but for white children born now in 1992. And what you can see here is that those red colors that we saw in the 1978 map, concentrated in the Southeast and Appalachia, they've basically spread across the United States. Put it differently, it used to be the case that for white kids born to low-income parents back in 1978, if you grew up in the Northeast or if you grew up in parts of California, you'd still have a pretty good chance of achieving the American dream of rising up. That's no longer the case. Rates of upward mobility for white children in those places now look like rates of upward mobility that you see in Appalachia. So that's the picture in terms of what's happened for white kids growing up in low-income families. Now let me contrast that with the same analysis done for Black Americans. Here now we're showing the data for kids born in 1978. Much of the map is missing because, as you know, there's not a sufficiently large Black population in many parts of the United States to be able to construct these statistics. Where there is a sufficiently large Black population, we're calculating the same exact measures of upward mobility. But for reasons you will see in a second, we're using a different color scheme. Purple here denotes areas with the lowest levels of upward mobility. The peach-orange color are places with the highest levels of upward mobility. And you can see that in 1978, you had slightly higher levels of upward mobility on the coast for Black kids than you did in cities in the Midwest and parts of the Southeast. So now again, let's look at what happens for kids born in 1992. And you can see here the opposite pattern of what we saw for white kids. The map is reflecting higher levels of upward mobility for Black children born in 1992. The colors are going from purple to the peach-orange color. Places like Detroit and Cleveland, which in the past offered very poor chances of rising up, now look a bit better. Now, one critical point that I want to emphasize, and Samantha brought up, I think, quite clearly in her introduction, is that while there has been progress for Black Americans, and I think that is a very good thing, we want to be very clear that that does not mean that we are anywhere close to closing these racial gaps. And just to underscore that point, I want to turn to this slide here, which shows you the data you've already seen, but now side by side for Black kids born in 1992 on the left and white kids born in 1992 on the right. And the key thing that I want to stress is if you look at the color scales now compared to each other on the bottom of the slide, you can see that even in 1992, there is no place in America where Black children have the same rates of upward mobility as the worst places for upward mobility for white kids. These are still two completely non-overlapping distributions. The very best places in terms of upward mobility for Black kids, where they can grow up to expect to earn about $26,000 a year, they have lower levels of upward mobility there than the worst places for upward mobility for white kids, where they have incomes of $30,800 a year. So there's been progress, but there's still an enormous gulf in terms of rates of upward economic mobility by race, simply because we started with such an enormous divide to begin with. Okay, so having established that, let me now make one further point about these geographic differences, which I think also speaks to an important part of the public discourse here, which is that the progress that we have seen for Black kids is absolutely not coming at the expense of progress for white children. In fact, if we look at changes in upward mobility for Black children on the vertical axis here, plotted against changes in upward mobility in those same cities for white children, you can see that there's a very strong positive relationship here. So what that's telling us is in the places where Black kids gain the most in terms of making the most progress in economic mobility, those are also the same places where white children did relatively better compared to other areas. So what that's showing you is these things go hand in hand. It's not like one group is gaining at the expense of the other. There's some common factors that are helping all of these groups progress or not do as well. This is not a zero-sum game. One further piece of nuance in understanding the nature of progress by race is shown by this bar chart here, where what we're looking at is, I think, one particularly important measure of economic mobility, which is the degree to which poverty persists across generations. So what I want you to think about here is imagine a set of kids who grow up in poor families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, and ask what fraction of them remain in the bottom fifth when they grow up. So To what extent does poverty persist across generations? That's arguably one of the most serious problems from an economic mobility perspective. You can see here that for kids born in 1978, there was a vast difference in the persistence of poverty between white and Black kids. 25% of white kids who grew up in poverty stayed in poverty in the next generation. For Black kids, that was 40%. Now, if you look at the same data for kids born in 1992, that 14.7 percentage point gap between the persistence of poverty for Black and white kids has grown dramatically smaller. It's shrunk to 4 percentage points, a 75% decline in the racial gap in the persistence of poverty, both because Black children are less likely to persist in poverty, so the orange bar has fallen, and also because the green bar has gone up. White children, unfortunately, are more likely to remain in poverty across generations. So we're seeing significant progress in terms of narrowing racial gaps, in terms of reductions in the persistence of poverty. However, that does not mean that we're seeing the same kind of progress in terms of people reaching the upper middle class or, truly achieving professional success, being in rooms like this in some sense. And so to show you that, here's the same kind of analysis, looking at kids who grew up in families in the bottom fifth, but now asking not do these kids remain in poverty, but rather what fraction of kids reach the top fifth of the income distribution? Maybe an aspiration that we would have for all of our children to reach the upper middle class. And you can see here that we've made literally no progress over the past 15 years. Only 3% of Black kids reach the top fifth, conditional on growing up in a low-income family, and that remains at 3% for kids born in 1992. So to wrap up in simple terms, what we see from these new data is that there's been progress made, I think significant progress that we should celebrate in terms of reductions in the persistence of poverty for Black Americans, but that has not translated to greater progress in terms of reaching the upper middle class. Kids are moving out of poverty into the middle class and so on, which I think is a good thing, but there's more progress to be made. One final piece of data to summarize the national picture. So I've shown you a bunch of statistics on what's happening across regions, by race, and so on. How can you sort of summarize this? What are the big picture averages here? So if you look at Black kids growing up in low-income families, their incomes went up by about $1,400 a year, something like 6 or 7% when we measure their incomes in their late 20s between the 1978 and 1992 birth cohorts. For white kids, incomes fell by $2,000 per year, about 8% decline over the same period. So that's what's contributed to the narrowing of the racial gap in upward economic mobility. I focus mainly on kids starting out in low-income families. We can also look in the data at kids starting out in high-income families. And here you see a different picture. For Black kids, you again see progress, better outcomes for kids born in more recent birth cohorts. For white kids, you also see progress if they were born to high-income parents. So if you compare the numbers in the column on the right here in this table, the phenomenon that we're seeing is an expansion of class gaps among white Americans. It matters more and more if you were born to rich parents or poor parents, while racial gaps in economic mobility are shrinking a bit. And hence the part of the title of the paper, Growing Class Gaps, Shrinking Race Gaps. Those are the headline findings from these new data on changing opportunity. In the last couple of minutes here, before we wrap up and get the reactions of the panel, I want to say a quick word about what we've learned about what's actually driving these trends in economic mobility. So in our team, we wanted to document these important new trends, but then we wanted to use those trends as a way to learn about the science of economic opportunity, what drives changes in economic opportunity. And so let me give you a quick overview. You can read more details in the paper and we can discuss further during the panel. At a big picture level, what we learned from many different analyses is that these changes are occurring at a community level. And there's one key variable that seems to predict these changes in economic mobility across subgroups and across areas. And that is, if you look at the horizontal axis of this plot, changes in parental employment rates in the area in which kids are growing up. So basically, to summarize briefly what this slide shows, if you grow up in an area where employment rates are going up in the broader community for your race and for your class background, you yourself have better prospects in adulthood. That's true for white kids, it's true for Black kids, it's true for rich kids, it's true for kids who grew up in poorer families. And that one variable, as you can see by the single line here, fully explains what's going on for white Americans, for Black Americans, and so on. So in particular, white Americans are increasingly growing up in communities that are not thriving, particularly if they're from low-income families, where employment has declined, maybe because of global competition, changes in technology, and so on. Black Americans, fortunately, Black kids are increasingly growing up in communities with higher parental employment rates, maybe because of progress through things like civil rights legislation, other changes in employment patterns that have helped the Black community and are now impacting the next generation. Now, one key point I want to stress here is that you might read these data saying, oh yeah, obviously if your parents are employed, that's got to be beneficial for you. That's not the takeaway from this. This is about community level parental employment rates, not about whether your own parents are employed or not. One way you can see that in a very simple way is I'm going to replicate that chart that I just showed you, but now looking only at the subset of kids whose own parents have remained employed. And you can see exactly the same relationship with community level employment rates. So the key here really seems to be about community as the unit of change, as has been emphasized in a lot of work in sociology based on ethnographic research, talking to people on the ground, folks like my colleague, William Julius Wilson, whose famous work many of you will know, that I think is very consistent with these ideas. Couple of final points. So why is it that these changes in parental employment rates are so strongly correlated with kids' outcomes? What is the mechanism here? What's going on? We distinguish between two hypotheses. Is this just about changes in job availability? If there are more jobs available, maybe Black kids and white kids end up doing better. Or is it something about changes in the childhood environment in which kids are growing up? If you're growing up in a community where lots of people are working, maybe it changes your aspirations, it changes your networks, it changes your resources in a way that allows you to thrive. And without going into too much detail here in the interest of time, basically what we find is strong evidence in support of the childhood environment hypothesis by looking at kids who move across areas. In particular, we find that same kind of relationship between changes in kids' outcomes and changes in parental employment rates if we look at kids who move to these improving areas when they're young, before age 8, for example, but not if they move there as teenagers, where you see a much flatter relationship, which is really showing you that what matters is where you grow up and what you're exposed to in those childhood years, not just the labor market that you enter into after you finish high school or finish college. Last point, we've established that these parental employment rates seem to really matter through a childhood environment exposure effect. Why is that? Is it because of a social interaction mechanism that if you're around people who are working, it changes your aspirations, changes the pathways you choose to pursue, maybe changes the types of job referrals you get? Or is it about the fact that if you have higher levels of parental employment, there might be more resources in your community, more funding for schools, more funding for local programs? What we're seeing, again, just giving you a very quick summary here, is that the data really seem to point to a social interaction hypothesis. In particular, by using data on differences in friendship patterns across groups, we find evidence that it's exactly the kids who you interact with the most. For example, in school, you tend to have more friends born in the same year as you than born the year before or the year after. And we're finding that the parental employment rates of the kids in your own grade matter much more in predicting your outcomes than the parental employment rates of kids born a year earlier or a year later, pointing strongly to the social interaction hypothesis as really being the key driver of what's going on. So let me sum up by saying a quick word about what I think all these data imply for what we're all here to discuss today. How can we improve economic opportunity going forward? The most important takeaway for me is that opportunity can change in short timeframes. In contrast with the way that I started and my concerns that, history casts a long shadow, that may well be true. That is true, I think. But despite that, it's possible that over a 10 or 15 years period, you can see quite substantial changes, a 1/3 shrinking of the Black-white gap in economic mobility, which means that we can really make progress here, and we just need to figure out how to put our heads together and create that change going forward. Concretely, how can we create that change? I take 3 things away from the study and the broader research our team and others have been doing. First, I think it's critical to support the next generation in communities that are currently falling behind. If you've got the local manufacturing plant closing, there's always a lot of focus on how do you help the workers who are working at that plant. What we're seeing here is that can affect the next generation in a really adverse way, and we need to target our efforts to helping people in those kinds of communities in the next generation. Second, the key unit of change is social communities within neighborhoods, not just places as a whole, but the group of people who are interacting with each other, which is often divided by racial lines, by class lines, and so on. That's the unit at which I think we should be concentrating our efforts. And finally, what should we be doing? I think there's traditionally a lot of focus on providing financial capital, wealth building, loans, and so on, human capital, education, and so forth. I think all of that can make a difference. What we're finding in these data and other work our team has done is that providing social capital, connections, networks, support to use these resources more effectively dramatically amplifies the impacts of programs that seek to improve economic mobility. One last note, you'll notice here that these broad conclusions maybe give us some guidance on where we should focus, but don't tell us exactly how we should intervene. To support the field in terms of understanding where we should target our efforts and make more investments going forward, and to help us learn about what works, we have again released new public data that all of you can access through the website opportunityatlas.org. That's a tool that's going to allow you to look up rates of economic mobility by race and by class in your own community. And you can look at which places have improved the most. You can see here, Charlotte, North Carolina, which I called out before, is one of the places where, quite encouragingly, economic mobility has increased the most in the past few years. Yet on the other hand, you have places like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which ranks 50th out of the 50 largest cities now in terms of, unfortunately, negative changes in economic mobility over the past 15 years. And I think we should be focusing our attention on places like that to improve economic opportunity for Black Americans and for everyone to the benefit of our country going forward. Thanks so much. And back to you, Samantha.
Thank you so much, Raj. There is so much for us to learn from this data and to dive into conversation about these insights. I'm glad to welcome into the conversation author of The Sum of Us, Heather McGhee, senior partner at McKinsey, Shelley Stewart, and president at Meridian Partners, Jim Shelton. So thank you to all of you for being in this conversation with us, but thank you even more so for being consistent advisors and thought partners to BEA. And on that point, would love to start just by hearing each of your headline level takeaways and reflections on the data that Raj just shared with us. So if we can start with you, Heather.
Happy to. So first of all, I want to say thank you, of course, to Sam and to BEA for being stalwart institutions focusing on the importance of work, wages, and wealth in the Black community and bringing so much star power and superpower to that. Can everyone hear me okay?
We got you, Heather.
Okay, great. And then I really just want to give a lot of appreciation to Raj. Raj, your leadership in bringing data to set and maintain a relentless focus on inequality and mobility in this country. I really can't say enough about the impact that you have had. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you again. So I was very excited when I learned about this data, being able to break the incredible tax trove of tax data down by race. And as soon as I saw sort of an early draft of it, I both was excited about the story of progress and concerned about what our meaning making through the media, through politics, through just individuals taking their own biases and underlying narratives and absorbing this data, concerned about the meaning making that could happen with it. And I know we're going to get into that conversation. But first, the good news here is that a generation of adults, I think both of the children born in 92, but also, of course, what does that mean about who their parents were and what had shaped their lives? A generation of adults who gave birth to millennials, who had been really the first generation in American history as Black people to grow up with the shadow of Jim Crow's legal restrictions on where and if they could work and live, gone, at least legally, right? Of course, we should see a massive improvement from the generation that was born in 1978. And I think in many ways, this reaffirms the idea that structures matter, policies matter, that race-based policies matter, because the removal of those explicitly racist policies allowed Black families to begin to eke out some progress. And I think that's very, very important. And I think we should talk about affirmative action, particularly given the fact that we are now in a post-affirmative action in higher education moment. Let us begin to ask the question of where and how can equal opportunity policies be layered onto this data, and how can we understand how equal opportunity actually help to contribute to this bump in mobility. But I do think that it's also important to note that when we, as people who work with data very sort of fluently, focus on rates of change, we often, for the lay consumer of that data, end up obscuring a little bit what reality is for families making less than $27,000 a year, right? So as I've heard people discussing it, as I've read the coverage of it, I have heard a shorthand of white poor kids are doing worse and Black poor kids are doing better. And that is really discussing the rate of change of their incomes. Of course, it's not talking about wealth at all, which we know is really what ends up creating a quality of life and a sense of security or not. But it's also often forgetting the fact that, of course, we are talking about different scales, and still white children are doing better, living better, buying more groceries, being able to pay the light bill more than even the kids, the young adults who have seen a higher rate of change from their parents. And so I think, given the pervasiveness of negativity around Black people and money in our society, we should take this moment to celebrate the fact that with the barriers reduced, the poorest Black families, which is not a small share of the Black community, right, as opposed to what it is with the white community, right, that the poorest Black families have been able to see their children do better than them at a higher rate than the previous generation. We should celebrate that. But we should also make sure that we don't have a takeaway of race no longer matters as much as class, which has been the digestion in some of the news media, because it's simply not borne out by Raj's data, right? And I think we need to be very clear about that.
Thank you, Heather. Over to you, Shelley.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Sam, for convening us. And Raj, thank you for your continued, your really thoughtful and analytic work. And look, I'll be brief, and because I know there's a few other things we want to discuss here. Look, the first is I just pick up on Heather's point and say we should take the moment to do a small celebration, not capital IC, but like small celebration on the fact that progress has been made. And that's actually consistent with some of the work that we recently did out of the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility. That being said, we know it was from a very low base, and we know significant gaps remain in the way Black Americans experience the economy, right? Whether it be income, assets, home ownership, consumer access. I mean, you're still, if you live in a majority Black community, you're 2.5 times more likely to live in a healthcare desert, 2 times more likely to live in a food desert, 40% more likely to live in a place without affordable housing, 20% more likely to live in a banking desert. So these are real, there's a real dearth of access. And so we just need to continue to hold and raise that up, even in the context of progress. It's not acceptable, right? I mean, life expectancy rates, all these things that we know we should really care about. I mean, we did an analysis a few years back that said, if we could get to, parity in terms of like how long we should live, a very basic measure, there'd be a few million more Black people alive today. And you can just think about, emotionally, what that means, and even what it means for the economy, if you want to be crass. I think there is a broader point, though, which is there is often a belief that the only thing that matters in the context of an economic system is growth or productivity improvements. And the reality of it is productivity improvements alone does not mean that you are increasing the standard of living for all. There's a notion of the distribution of how those benefits accrue. And I think this work, if you look, whether it's, I just look at on the whole for poor Americans, it is clear that we have not yet really gotten a grasp on how to think about that distribution and what it means for the American dream. And so I think this implicates government. I think it implicates the private sector. We have got to be thinking about how we're going to foster job creation, not any job, but good quality jobs in places. And I think we've really got to be, frankly, reimagining how we think about that, especially in light of some of the big headwinds with respect to automation, which have only been accelerating over time. And so the relative differences are interesting, and we're happy to see progress. I think there's a broader discussion about how we think about growth and productivity and the distribution of how those gains and benefits accrue to all Americans.
Jim?
So I'll pick up right there. First, I have to just also say my thanks not only to Sam, you convening us, but as Blue Meridian Partners, our whole mission is to transform the life trajectories of people who are low income and trying to move out of poverty. Our strategy began actually with a slide that is built off of Raj's initial slide, which looked at economic mobility across the country. And the context of this work that we just talked about, our place-based investing strategy is literally called Place Matters. That, in fact, where you live determines what kind of opportunities you have access to, and therefore what your life chances are, let alone your ultimate life outcomes. So the foundations of what we've talked about are really important. I just want to go back even before the map that Raj put out. He put out a study that basically said that across the country, economic mobility has been falling for all Americans in aggregate. And that was, if you were born in the 1940s, then you had a better than 90% chance of doing better than your parents. And if you were born in the 1980s, that had dropped down to a 50% chance. And there was no reason at that particular time to think that that trajectory was actually going to change. So that's the first part of it, is that this is a trend that we've actually seen. The second thing is that the reality is that we focused on these changes without really focusing on the absolute numbers as much as we should. And Raj did a great job of coming back into that at the end. But the reality is that I thought that there's been a lot of news coverage. I thought in this particular case, the Wall Street Journal did something really good, which was to always present these things so you can see the movement relative to each other, exactly how far below white people, Black people are, and then with every improvement that, in fact, it's still not even close to catching up. The third thing I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of is that, as everyone has pointed out, this is progress, but progress against a very low base. But more importantly, there are Americans also who are moving away from opportunity. And none of us are actually served well in that context. So the fact that Black people are doing better, but not enough to actually thrive, and white people are actually in some places doing worse, the lowest income who actually need support, doing worse, that is a story that the entire nation should be mobilized around rapidly. What I will say is that the good news is the data bears this out. And so some of the things that have been happening are actually reinforced. And here's an example of that. So I mentioned our strategy. Our strategy is literally focused on, in places, how you actually connect people, one, to opportunities to help them be better prepared and to actually be able to jump into opportunities when they arise. But in particular now, how do you actually make sure those opportunities are welcoming to them when they show up? How do you make sure that there are actually pathways into those places and that you can actually break through the barriers that have been there historically? That's one part of it. If you even look at the work that the administration has done, where they have organized a lot of their economic development work around place. Last week, actually, I participated in the conference that they held, where the folks who won the Tech Hubs funding, or the NSF Engine funding, or the Good Jobs funding, all of that work is designed to drive dollars and resources to create new jobs in places around the country where jobs have disappeared. Those will benefit Black communities, those will benefit white communities, but most importantly, what they'll do is start to create the infrastructure of support that families need to be able to provide for their children, and the context where children are seeing new jobs and new opportunity available to them. Like, this is about both mindset shift and opportunity shift, and then creating real pathways that are open to everyone in the way they haven't been done in the past. There's a role for philanthropy in that, but we have to recognize that it's frankly going to be policy that is the big driver of whether or not we actually see the change that we want to see at scale.
Right. Thanks, Jim. So with the data and those takeaways as the backdrop, we're going to dive into a conversation both about how the narrative is being shaped around the data, and then also what the data is teaching us about these actual solutions. But first, Raj, just want to come back to you and see if there's anything that you want to reflect back on from Jim and Heather and Shelley's comments.
Just very briefly, I mean, I really appreciate everything Heather, Shelley, and Jim said, and absolutely agree. I want to pick up on one point Shelley made on productivity and inequality, which I absolutely agree with. Economics has traditionally focused on issues of productivity and has put those as sort of two different issues, or often, you know, you hear a term, if you take like an Econ 101 class, equity, efficiency, trade-off, we've got to pick between the two. My view increasingly from these kinds of data is that has it totally backwards. I actually think if you have more equity, more equality of opportunity, you actually can get more growth because you are including more people who can start successful businesses, who can discover new drugs, who can discover new technologies. I think you know, Samantha, from some of our earlier work on Lost Einsteins. Our perspective from these data is there are lots of kids out there who can not only achieve better economic progress for themselves, but contribute to the economy as a whole by doing things that are going to benefit all of us. And so I think it's very important that we change the mindset that we don't have to pick between one or the other. We can actually do both of these things at the same time by addressing these important issues.
So as Raj shared in the presentation, and we've spoke about a little bit, the data itself reinforces that improvements in economic mobility are not zero sum, not the improvements in Black economic mobility at the expense of improvements in white economic mobility. However, when the data was released, we saw some immediate headlines framing it in just those terms. So to quote the New York Times headline, "Who can achieve the American dream? Race matters less than it used to," and a follow-on piece which argued a common theory about Donald Trump's appeal is that working class white people feel they fell behind as other groups pulled ahead. He recognized the sentiment and spoke to those voters' concerns. It turns out that those concerns are grounded in real economic changes, a study from Harvard researchers shows. The researchers analyzed census and tax records covering 57 million children to look at people's ability to rise to the middle and upper class, their mobility over 2 recent generations. They found that it had improved among Black people and deteriorated among poor white people. BEA has been actively pushing against this narrative and all that we anticipate and know it brings with us. Political scapegoating and misallocation of resources. Heather, we'll start with you. You've written extensively and beautifully on the misapplication of zero-sum thinking to economic policy. So can you provide some additional context into what's happening here, why is it happening, and how we should think about responding?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that I came to an understanding of the centrality of zero-sum thinking in the American imagination, kind of out of desperation, because as a policy wonk, I was trying to bring good data to bear on questions of mobility, opportunity, and inequality, and finding that there were so many roadblocks among the political class, among voters, particularly white voters, that I needed to understand really what was going on deeper. What were the deeper narratives that were meaning that we were putting out data at the think tank that I ran, Demos, but the same kinds of story that I thought it was telling was actually being absorbed in a very different way by consumers of that data. And so the zero-sum story, which says that there's a fixed pie of well-being, and if my group gets a bigger slice, some other group must be getting a smaller slice, is our core dominant narrative in terms of understanding how progress works and how resources are shared in society. And that is no accident. It is, as I write in the first chapter of my book, really a story that was developed and sold by the colonial plantation class and has been sort of reanimated, usually largely by wealthy white people who want to keep power concentrated in a small set of hands to make people in relative similar economic circumstances resent one another nonetheless, right? And, it is no accident that we hear Donald Trump's name as one of the people who really sold this story aggressively and continues to. But it is an important way in which any program or policy that might benefit someone else, a different generation, young people with student debt, child tax credits, anything is filtered through, particularly white Americans who are much more likely to view the world through a zero-sum prism than are Black Americans. That policy that could help somebody else is seen not just as a good thing for your neighbor, and maybe even wouldn't it be nice if all of our neighbors were doing better, but rather something that was coming at the expense of me, right, as a white person in this scenario. And so that is why when we talk about rates of change and gaps, it actually does activate that zero-sum thinking. And it makes us less sensitive to other truths. For example, the fact that Black people are still not doing as well with a college degree in terms of wealth than a white high school dropout is, right? And so we really do need to be sensitive to that zero-sum thinking and the way that it is deployed by people who are using it strategically in order to break working class solidarity across race. And of course, I thought it was wonderful for the paper to really hone in on refuting that zero-sum thinking explicitly and say that places where the economic and social circumstances were good for white people, it was good for Black people and vice versa. But it's, as you see from the metabolism in the news media, there are just ways in which it is very difficult for people to, especially white journalists, white politicians, white voters, to get past that zero-sum thinking and not lead a story of progress for Black people to therefore have been revealing a truth of about that progress being at the expense of white people and therefore lead to a politics of resentment that we know breaks, saps our national strength as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So Jim and Shelley, in our earlier conversations, each of you had thoughts about how this applied to both how we're articulating the storyline of the data, but also the solutions that it proposes might be the right ones for Black Americans and all Americans. So let's come to you, Jim, first, and then Shelley.
Oh, sure. So one, just want to echo everything that Heather just said. The power of Raj's work combined with the power of Heather's thinking about the role of solidarity dividends and the fact that, in fact, when you look at it, the things that allowed Black people to make progress through the data now, we can see it empirically, are the same things that stabilize White communities in the country. That's something that we actually all have to hold on to. The second thing is that then you say, well, what are those things that we have learned that allow Black people who have been living in low-income communities that have been having higher levels of unemployment as a kind of a regular thing in their communities? What have we learned about how you actually stabilize those young children and help them to actually find pathways to opportunity that might be disproportionate to what would be expected given their context? I think that what we're finding is that that is now a relevant set of things to understand for other populations as well. So what we're seeing is that the work that we've done, whether it's in the Harlem Children's Zone, or the work we're doing in communities like Spartanburg, or the work we're doing in Dallas or other, where we are looking through the lens of, oh, well, if you look at the hardest hit communities, those turn out to be communities of color. But the relevant findings about what kids need when their parents aren't working or what their other parents aren't working, those things turn out the same, to be very much the same. And so when we worked with our colleagues and our partners down in Berea, Kentucky, and they use the very same framework that says our kids need supports from cradle all the way through the career, because what has happened to their parents means that their parents are not necessarily equipped to give them all the things that they might need in order to be able to thrive. That is an important finding that actually is reinforced by this body of work and that we need to continue to understand. The second thing is, though, that I think it's really important for us to recognize, and to Heather's point, that actually zero-sum thinking is not something that is the province of one community. And so we do have folks who are repeating these things that are in every community that make it seem like it's a zero-sum game. And we all have to guard against it in really important ways. Because what the reason that I think that we are susceptible to these narratives in some ways is people have an experience, right? So after the 2008-2010 recession, 50% of the jobs went to 3% of the counties. People have a real experience that jobs did not come to where they live. Who they are being told benefited and how is something that is completely untrue. But the fact that they experienced that this growth happened and didn't happen for them, they're actually seeing that. So for all of us to be able to be in a conversation that says, we actually all have an upside in a new narrative about what it actually takes in terms of getting jobs in this country and building supply chains that work well within inside the country, in terms of connecting young people and communities to those jobs and making sure that whether your parents had a good job or not, you actually can find your way into those kind of jobs. That is the one that is going to be broadly relevant to all Americans and can actually bring a level of solidarity that that I credit Heather for just teaching us all about, that can actually move the country in a way that has never happened before. And I just am excited to be here with all of you, because philanthropy can play a role, but again, it will come back to all of us working together to get our policy to reflect it.
Yeah, and I'll be brief again. I mean, I think if I just take a macro perspective, the U.S. economy, I mean, I can say, to build on Raj's point earlier, if we invest in underinvested communities and children, it will be better for the economy. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, we've looked at it. I mean, many folks in academia have looked at it. We've looked at it as McKinsey. Citi put out some great work on this, the Kellogg Foundation. There are trillions of dollars that we are forfeiting by virtue of not investing in our communities and in our children. And so I think, and one of the frames I like is what's going on, in the state of Maryland, a very simple frame, which is eradicate childhood poverty. And if you actually read the language there around why that is good for the state, it's not partisan. It actually will reduce the budget over time. I know a lot of folks like that who are on the right, and folks on the left want, certain things. And so if you can increase the productivity, you can bring down healthcare costs, you can reduce costs of in the criminal justice system, you increase social cohesion, you boost innovation over time. It should not be a partisan issue. If we can eradicate childhood poverty, investing in our poor communities, everyone will benefit. And I think we just have to continue to push that narrative, both at the micro level, but then as we zoom out and say, is it good for the whole of the economy? The answer is yes.
So in our closing moments, we're going to share one of the questions that came through from our participants, just about, given all of this data and the context that we've been discussing, what are the solutions, the economic policy solutions that you all would encourage this audience of leaders across business, government, and philanthropy to be laser focused on? So that's for anyone to jump in on. Just what are those key solutions that are top of mind and that you hope that this group is building consensus around?
I mean, I'll jump in and say, continue the policies of actually driving for the creation of jobs where people actually need them, and creating pathways for people into those jobs. And then in particular in the neighborhoods or communities that have been the hardest hit, making sure those career pathways of supports are available so that children can actually find their way to those jobs over time.
One important policy is the reform of labor laws. We're talking about the quantity of jobs, but also about the social networks, right? And we know that places with higher labor union density are having, and growing labor union density, or at least stabilizing, have both, more social infrastructure coming out of that template of collective action that happens in labor organizing, and also more upward mobility, and the education level of the children of union parents it's one of the highest predictors, right? The completion of college in terms of the parents having being in a collective bargaining agreement. And so we can do federal labor law reform. We can look at states, the maps where unions are under attack, and we can take this moment of very, very high level support, especially among young people and young workers, for unions to really press the momentum to try to help level the playing field for workers in this country.
Yeah, plus one to all of those things. And I would just continue to just lift up the idea of job creation in the places where people are, and then continuing to invest in education. And personal view is in rejecting this idea that the wealth that you have in your near community should dictate the quality of your education. That is backwards. We should be investing more in communities where people don't have wealth, so that we can unlock that latent potential of those children.
Maybe I can just jump in here with a thought as well, echoing what others here have said, both from this study and years of studying these questions. I guess a key takeaway for me has been that there are going to be many different solutions that vary across communities. Sometimes it's about bringing jobs. Sometimes it's about investing in education. Sometimes it's about changing the networks that people have. I think some of these new data where we're able to see how things are varying, not just in terms of changes in economic mobility, but what social networks look like place by place, can help us come up with those customized solutions. And a key theme that I mentioned at the end of the presentation, I'll just note here again, is in many different policy domains, we're finding that taking this multi-pronged approach of social capital plus financial capital or social capital plus education is extremely important. Just to give you a concrete example, there's been a history of job training programs in the US that try to get people into better jobs. Unfortunately, over the past 30 years, if you look at randomized trials, many of those programs don't show great impacts, but a new wave of programs that really, in my view, both provide people with skills to get new jobs, but also connections to specific employers who want to hire for those jobs. I'm thinking of programs like Year Up or Per Scholas are showing really strong impacts in randomized trials. I think that way of thinking, not just in job training, but more broadly, is something we can all transport to all the different domains we work in.
And I'll share that BEA Foundation over the last year has released both a policy agenda to advance Black work wages and wealth, and also an architecture for action that curates the leading solutions across the different economic systems to be able to advance Black economic prosperity and wealth building that's directed towards the private and philanthropic sectors with the great insights and expertise of Jim and Shelley and Heather leaning into both of those solution sets. So we will be sure to share those along with additional resources in the follow-up to this call. With that, I will close with a big thank you. This conversation, we hope, has been helpful to everyone on the line, both in shaping our work driven by the data and also in leaning into our responsibility and ability to ensure that that data is used in the way that it should to advance the rate of change for building Black economic prosperity and wealth building. It has been a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you again, Raj, Heather, Shelley, and Jim, and have a wonderful rest of the day.